Hello. Tonight, or today, depending on when you're watching, we're going to be talking about the reading that was assigned from John Stuart Mill, starting on page 225 of your textbook. Um, Last time, we talked about Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism, how Jeremy Bentham, both he and Mill and Epicurus, who is seen as somewhat of a progenitor of utilitarianism, were all atheists. And we talked last time about the greatest happiness principle and the principle of utility, and how utilitarianism, especially in its early days, was subject to a certain kind of a critique that it would, kind of devolve into a society, if it were broadly applied, devolve into a society where people were just these hedonists and into these base and animal pleasures. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that this time, and because this is the critique that John Stuart Mill is going to specifically answer. Let's start with a little bit of biographical information, right? So we talked last time about how Jeremy Bentham was friends with John Stuart Mill's father, right? And how named James Mill, and that Jeremy Bentham and James Mill designed this educational plan for John Stuart Mill, basically to raise him up to be the champion of utilitarian ethics. And their plan worked. I mean, he really was a champion of utilitarian ethics. His education started when he was at the tender age of 3. Um, and he's got 3 very famous books, right? Probably this On Liberty is probably his most famous book, which is about classical liberalism. And then Utilitarianism, the book that we're going to be reading from, is probably the second most famous book, which is a defense of this new moral philosophy begun by Jeremy Bentham. And then his third most famous book is an essay called On the Subjection of Women, which really is a very important and formational and foundational feminist text, which ultimately contributed to the movement for women's suffrage that was successful then in the early 20th century. So that is Mill. Let's take a look at our text. So our text opens up in chapter 2 of his book Utilitarianism. So it's not the whole thing, right? And he kind of starts with trying to give a definition, right, of utilitarianism. He says an apology is due to the philosophical opponents of utilitarianism. And he doesn't mean apology in the modern sense, but he means apology in the philosophical sense, which is an explanation or an account, right? He's going to give an explanation or an account to the philosophical opponents of utilitarianism. He says an apology is due to them for even the momentary appearance of confounding them with anyone capable of so absurd a misconception, which is the more extraordinary inasmuch as the contrary accusations of referring everything to pleasure, and that too in its grossest form, is another of the common charges against utilitarianism, and has been pointedly remarked by an able writer. The same sort of persons, and often the very same persons, denounce the theory as impracticably dry when the word utility precedes the word pleasure, and as too practicably voluptuous when the word pleasure precedes the word utility. Well, um, if we had read, and maybe you feel that John Stuart Mill is dry, if we had read Jeremy Bentham, then you would have an understanding really of what these critics are saying, that that the philosophical exposition of utilitarianism is very dry indeed, and it kind of ironically does seem funny that it's associated with pleasure. But Mill proceeds, and this is on page 228. It says, those who know anything about the matter are very aware that every writer from Epicurus To Bentham, who maintained the theory of utility, meant by it not something to be contradistinguished from pleasure, but pleasure itself, together with exemption from pain, and instead of opposing the useful to the agreeable or the ornamental, have always declared that the useful means these, among other things. Right? So he already is including Epicurus, and so it's not going to be a surprise to us that he's going to end up with a philosophy that looks something like what Epicurus had. So remember, Epicurus is this philosopher of pleasure, but then he says that the good life is one that's lived in such a manner that the person is wealthy, wise, and just. Sorry, healthy, well, wise, and just. That was the language that we had used for Epicurus. Well, wise, and just, meaning that somebody is paying attention to the development of the mind, paying attention to the health of the body, and paying attention to the health of one's relations with one's neighbors, which does not sound like a hedonism. And so, as you might guess, Mill is going to go in a similar direction, right? Um, and he continues the same thought here. He says, yes, the common herd, including the herd of writers, not only in newspapers and periodicals, but in books of weight and pretension, are perpetually failing in this shallow mistake, having caught up the word utilitarian while knowing nothing whatever about it but its sound. They habitually express by it the rejection or the neglect of pleasure in some of its forms, of beauty, of ornament, or of amusement. Right? Nor is the term thus ignorantly misapplied solely in disparagement, but occasionally in compliment, as though it implied superiority to frivolity or the mere pleasures of the moment, and this perverted use is the only one in which the word is popularly known, and the one from which the new generation are acquiring their sole notion of its meaning. Right? So he's framing the problem here, right? Is that utilitarianism is seen as this philosophy that tries to justify these base pleasures as somehow replacing morality, and this is the problem that he's going to answer, right? And he starts his answer right away. He says the creed which accepts the foundation of morals, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. To give a clear view of the moral standard set up by the theory, much more requires to be said, in particular, what things it includes in the ideas of pain and pleasure, and to what extent this is left an open question. Right? So, I mean, he's not trying to weasel out of it, right? So, right there on page 229, we have a really good articulation of what he means, right? Of what he means by the principle of utility. Right? On page 230, um, he gets kind of more into the problems that the Epicureans faced coming out of antiquity, and this was chiefly from the Christians who were resurgent. Well, not resurgent, but the Christians who were becoming popular, really beginning in the probably third and fourth, more fourth century BC, right? And speaking of the Epicureans, says, now such a theory of life excites in many minds, and among them in some the most estimable, and feeling and purpose inveterate dislike. Right? This is the criticism of the Christians, right? To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object than desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine, to whom the followers of Epicurus were, at a very early period, contemptuously likened, and modern holders of the doctrine are occasionally made the subject of equally polite comparisons by its German, French, and English assailants. Right? When thus attacked, the Epicureans have always answered that it is not they but their accusers who represent human nature in a degrading light, since the accusations suppose human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. And if this supposition were true, the charge could not be gainsaid, but would then no longer that would then be no longer an imputation. For if the sources of pleasure were precisely the same to human beings as to swine, the rule of life which is good for the one would be good enough for the other. So he's getting into his counter argument already. And basically, Mill's counter argument to this accusation that the utilitarians are like pigs, interested only in pleasures of the belly and of the body, is that, well, if they were talking about pigs, that is indeed what they would be talking about, but they are instead talking about human beings, and human beings aren't like pigs. Right? So this is going to be his counterpoint, right? Is that we are not talking about pigs, we are talking about animals. So let's jump over to page 231, where he kind of gets into his argument more clearly. And this is a little bit more than halfway down the page. He says, few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. Right? And so his evidence really is that apparently human beings don't find pleasures in the base animal things because they wouldn't choose to have those if it meant giving up their higher faculties. So interestingly enough, I think we have an example of this from popular culture. So I think one of the films, and it's really from my generation more than yours, and so I do apologize. But one of the films from my generation that I think that most young people have seen is The Matrix, right? Starring Keanu Reeves, and it's, the whole premise is that, we're all in this computer simulation, and they break him out, and he goes back in to liberate people. And in any case, one of the things that they have in there is that there's a traitor named Cypher, and Cypher betrays his compatriots, um, and what he wants is to go back into the Matrix, right? He wants to go back into the Matrix because he misses the sensual pleasures of life, right? They show him in the film eating a steak with Agent Smith, and he says to Agent Smith, that I know this steak isn't real, but it basically it sure is pleasurable, and this is what I want. And so Smith agrees, to work with him and to put him back into the Matrix. But what's really fascinating about this scene is that even though it seems to argue against what Mill is saying, that even this scene supports what Mill is saying, is that people would not choose ignorance over knowledge, right? Even if it meant more pleasure for them. Because what Cypher says to Agent Smith is that he doesn't want to remember anything, that he wants to go back into the Matrix and have a good life full of bodily pleasures, but not to remember anything. And that's because at some level, he knows that it would be less pleasurable than the life that he's leaving behind, right? And so this I think is an example of what Mill is talking about, and it's kind of a way for us to kind of get into his objection a little bit better. On page 232 there, at the end of the long first paragraph, right, where he's talking about how human beings are not animals, right, that we can never really wish to sink into what we feel to be a lower grade of existence. That's at the top of the page. At the bottom of that first long paragraph on 232 is, I think, the most important quote in the excerpt that we're reading from Mill. Right? He says, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides." Right? And so what he's going to do, what Mill does, is he sets up higher pleasures and lower pleasures for the hedonistic calculus, right? So what Bentham called the hedonistic calculus, you got higher pleasures and lower pleasures, and Mill is going to tell us that higher pleasures count for more than lower pleasures when you're doing the hedonistic calculus. The higher pleasure is worth more than the lower pleasure, and it's pretty clear what these higher pleasures are. You know, the higher pleasures are things like study and poetry and art and literature and science and um, civilization, right? And these lower pleasures are things like satiety, drunkenness, sexual pleasures, the animalistic things, right? So he has this scheme, right, where we have certain pleasures that we share in common with the animals, and then other pleasures that we share in common with human beings, only with human beings, and that those are higher and therefore they count more. I think it's really important that people understand what it means when we talk about the pleasures that pigs have. And I know most of you students have not had really exposure to pigs, but I have, and so let me share some of that with you. So sometimes in the summer, we will, in the beginning of the summer, we'll get a few piglets, and then we'll raise them. I live out in the country. We'll raise those piglets and then harvest them in the early winter. And pigs are something else. They like to eat like nobody's business. And the amount that they like to eat and the intensity with which they eat, the pleasure of eating, makes them actually difficult to feed. And so one of the things that we do when we feed our pigs is they eat, largely a diet of grain, right? And they eat, dig up some, roots and stuff, and they eat some insects. But oftentimes we also will feed them kind of any leftovers that we have. And when you go out to feed the pigs the leftovers, they get so excited at the thought of eating that they can't wait to get the food, right? And often you're pouring it out of a dish or pouring it out of a bucket. And if the pig is there, you're not able to actually get it into the pig dish because they're in the way. And you end up, as hard as you might try, because they are so intensely into the pleasure of eating, that you end up pouring the food often on top of their head because they won't get out of the way. They are so pleasure driven by eating that you would think that their activity itself would disrupt that, but it doesn't. It doesn't. They don't know the pleasure that's a little bit higher of waiting for the food to get in the dish, right? So that one, you'll get more of it, and two, it won't be contaminated with mud. But they won't wait for that, right? And so this is what it means to be pigs, right? So let's take a look again at what Mill says, right? Because immediately after that, he says, well, it may be objected that many who are capable of the higher pleasures occasionally under the influence of temptations postpone them to the lower, right? And we know that, right? College students know that in particular. They're in college because they're capable of the higher pleasures, but then Friday night rolls around and they postpone the higher pleasure for the sake of the lower pleasure, right? That's what they do. But Mill says, but this is quite compatible with the full appreciation of the intrinsic superiority of the higher. He says, men often, from infirmity of character, make their election for the nearer good, even though they know it to be less valuable, and this no less when the choice is between two bodily pleasures than when it is between the bodily and the mental. They pursue sensual indulgence to the injury of health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good, right? So this is what is he talking about here? He's talking about drinking to excess, right, so that you're feeling bad the next morning. Right? It says it may be further objected that men who begin with their youthful enthusiasm for everything noble as they advance in years sink into indolence and selfishness. But I do not believe that those who undergo this very common change voluntarily choose the lower description of pleasures in preference to the higher. I believe that before they devote themselves exclusively to the one, they have already become incapable of the other. Right? Men lose, this is a little bit farther down, men lose their high aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes because they have not time or opportunity for indulging them, and they addict themselves to inferior pleasures. Right? So we might think of that as men are frustrated in their aspirations, right? As they are stuck in the dead end jobs, if they become the man in the gray flannel suit or whatever, um, then that's when they find these vices of middle age, because they have found that they are incapable. Their efforts towards achieving the higher pleasures have been sufficiently thwarted. Um, and this, I think, is Mill is describing here the midlife crisis, right? In with um, a utilitarian heuristic. All right, let's take a look at some of the other things he said. He is promoting his view that the higher pleasures are more important there on page 236, where he says, next to selfishness, the principal cause which makes life unsatisfactory is want of mental cultivation. A cultivated mind, and I do not mean that of a philosopher, but any mind to which the fountains of knowledge have been opened, and which has been taught, in any tolerable degree, to exercise its faculties, finds sources of inexhaustible interest in all that surrounds it, in the objects of nature, the achievements of art, the imaginations of poetry, the incidents of history, the ways of mankind past and present, and their prospects in the future. Right? Thus he explains higher pleasures. On page 237, he continues, in a world in which there is so much to interest, so much to enjoy, so much also to correct and improve, everyone who has this moderate amount of moral intellectual requisites is capable of an existence which may be called enviable. And unless such a person, through bad laws or subjection to the will of others, is denied the liberty to use the sources of happiness within his reach, he will not fail to find this enviable existence. If he escape the positive evils of life, the great sources of physical and mental suffering, such as indigence, disease, and the unkindness, worthlessness, or premature loss of objects of affection. Right? He continues further down the page. Poverty, in any sense implying suffering, may be completely extinguished by the wisdom of society combined with the good sense and providence of individuals. So, what is he saying? He's saying, well, it's the evils that we experience that cause us um, suffering. But if we were to liberate ourselves educate the populace, right? He was a big fan of education, that we would find that people would come up with new and innovative solutions, better ways to live. They would have their curiosity stimulated, and the world would improve. This is a program, utilitarianism, for individual improvement and social improvement of everybody. Sorry, there's a blip there because I had to pause to sneeze. So that's the first thing he's saying. There's higher and lower pleasures. The next thing um, that he wants to talk about is that there is this principle of equality in utilitarianism that we sometimes lose. Right? We sometimes get caught up in this whole idea of pleasure and what people will do for pleasure, that um, we miss this other concept there of equality, the fundamental equality of human beings, and that really is something laudable. And so, oftentimes people think of utilitarianism as something that's kind of like this selfish philosophy, but it really isn't, because there is room in it for selflessness, because we believe that the happiness of other people is also critically important. And I want to start on the very bottom of page 238 here. There's a line. It says, it says, though it is only in a very imperfect state of the world's arrangements that anyone can best serve the happiness of others by the absolute sacrifice of his own, yet so long as the world is in that imperfect state, I fully acknowledge that the readiness to make such a sacrifice is the highest virtue which can be found in man. Right? He's talking about this call to sacrifice. In the middle of page 239, he continues, the utilitarian morality does recognize in human beings the power of sacrificing their own greatest good for the good of others. It only refuses to admit that the sacrifice is itself a good, a sacrifice which does not increase or tend to increase the sum total of happiness it considers as wasted. The only self renunciation which it applauds, its devotion to happiness, or some of the means of happiness of others, either of mankind collectively or of individuals within the limits imposed by the collective interests of mankind. Right? So there is this big place for self-sacrifice. But what's interesting about utilitarianism is that there's a way to evaluate um, the quality of that sacrifice. Right? Was that sacrifice in vain? If it did not promote the happiness of others, then it was in vain. And it's incumbent upon us then to make sure that the sacrifices performed by other people do result in a net increase of the happiness of others. Right? So whenever we say things like it is important for us that these men shall not have died in vain, right? This is the Gettysburg Address of Abraham Lincoln, right? That these men shall not have died in vain. Mill is telling us that that sentiment is a sentiment that that is a utilitarian sentiment. It's a consequentialist sentiment, that the value of sacrifice is found in our making it useful in the world, making it fruitful in the world. Um, and really, I think that these are the two main arguments that he makes in this chapter. These are the two things that I want you really to come away with understanding, is one, that there are higher and lower pleasures, and two, that there's this room for self-sacrifice um, in utilitarianism. The next part of the reading is from chapter 4 of his text on utilitarianism. And this one deals with what sort of proof the principle of utilitarianism can provide for itself. And Mill is very honest about this, that it's there's not an a priori proof, right? This is not a philosophy like Kantianism, but it doesn't pretend to be a philosophy like Kantianism, right? This is ethics according to our experience in the world, not ethics according to um, our thoughts to ourselves. And so there is just a little section that I want to read here. It's on page 252 of your text, and he's talking about the proof for the principle of utility. He says, there is nothing in reality, nothing desired except happiness. This is on page 252 at the bottom. Whatever is desired otherwise than as a means to some end beyond itself, and ultimately to happiness, is desired as itself a part of happiness, and is not desired for itself until it has become so. Those who desire virtue for its own sake desire it either because the consciousness of it is a pleasure, or because the consciousness of being without it is a pain, or for both reasons united. As in the truth, the pleasure and pain seldom exist separately, but almost always together, the same person feeling pleasure in the degree of virtue attained, and pain in not having attained more. Then he continues there down on page 253 a little bit farther. If so, happiness is the sole end of human action, and the promotion of it by if so, happiness is the sole end of human action, and the promotion of it the test by which to judge all human conduct, from whence it necessarily follows that it must be the criterion of morality, since a part is included in the whole. And this really is what he offers, that everything is done for the sake of happiness, and that all people are equal. But it's hard to establish that first part sometimes, I think, with the second part. Kant does an excellent job in giving us a case for equality, but he doesn't care about our happiness. Mill cares a great deal about our happiness and cares a lot about equality, but I think that his materialistic physics doesn't necessarily give us an argument for equality in the same way. Anyway, that is what we need to say about utilitarianism. Next week, we're going to read a lot, and some of the material for next week is going to be posted um, on Saturday. So this week, last week we had a lot of lectures, no quizzes. This week, just a little bit kind of, we're going to have a breath this week. Next week, we're going to read a lot. We're going to read 2 essays about abortion, one pro and one con. We're also going to read 2 pieces about civil disobedience, one pro and one con. Both of these questions are really live, active questions for our society right now. We're going to look at different kinds of arguments for them, right? What does virtue say? What does utilitarianism say? What does deontology say? What does natural law say? And we're going to look at different ways of looking at these arguments, and that's going to be next week. And we're also going to, I think we're going to give the, at the end of next week, well, we're going to do a second midterm. And I think that I'm going to try to put that up also on Saturday. So alongside of our reading next week, there's going to be that. And then the final week, we'll post the final. We're not going to do the essay like is in the syllabus because there's just not time. The 8-week compressed schedule is really difficult to work with because it's not just the number of hours you spend interacting with this material, but it's having time to kind of live with it for a while, that is going to give you the capacity to go out into the community and see how it's interacting with your neighbors. So we're going to be skipping the paper. We're going to do the other midterm exam next week, and then we'll do the final on the week after. All right, so that is it for right now. Look for more material on Saturday.